Um, cool. So in components, I'm just going to create a counter.js or JSX. Also, JSX, JS doesn't really matter. I think with JSX, just VS Codes make some help you with like JSX related stuff, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Now counter is going to be a functional component. Let's do counter. Oops. Counter. Export it. Let's export it. There's import as always React. From React. And counter very simply is going to return a div with, this is something that I learned from Carlos, that you actually don't need to type the entire tag. You just say button and then it creates it for you. We're going to have a button, let's call it plus, another one for minus, and sort of a display, which is p, going to be a p counter. For now, let's just sort of initialize counter here to maybe 1. Just like that. Very simple component. Let's just import that component here. Oops. Import that component in app so that we do counter. This imported it for me. And let's look at the component. Over here, yeah, we have what we asked for. Simple, minimal counter. Now, yesterday we saw how we will get this to work with React State as well as with hooks, right? Now we're gonna do Redux, mainly to talk about all these concepts that we have. So I said now our state is going to be kept in the store, so we first need to create a store. And we are then, the way in which we're going to modify that state in the store is through dispatch and actions. So we need to get this function, the dispatch function. We need to create some actions. And yeah, so let's do that. So there are multiple sort of architectures and folder structures you can follow to create this. You're going to see a few different ones as you see tutorials online and other React and Redux code. The way that I like to do it is in the source folder, I create a folder called store. And in this store, I'm gonna keep the store, of course. I'm gonna keep the reducers, and I'm gonna keep some actions. And then I'm gonna import those in my component to actually dispatch. Okay, so for this, we need, since we're actually now going to integrate Redux, we are going to need to install 2 packages with npm install. We need React Redux as well as Redux. Let me see. Let me go back here to npm. I'm thinking about if we need Redux because I think Redux is already a dependency of React Redux, so maybe we don't need to install it explicitly. But let's just go here, React Redux, to see the documentation. Let's see if in the installation they actually recommend also installing Redux. Oh, so yeah, we can see here, for instance, that in the dependencies of React Redux, Redux is not here. That's just because React Redux is separate from Redux itself. Remember that Redux you could use with any library. Redux is not a React only thing. It's used in other contexts. And React Redux is the one that is going to let us integrate Redux with React. And we can see here that for React Redux, Redux is not a dependency of it. So it's completely independent and tested separately. So what that's telling us is, if we look at here in the installation, I think I was expecting them to say here install React Redux as well as Redux. Anyway, we're gonna need Redux. So let's do npm install React Redux and Redux. Those are the two packages that we're gonna need. While that is loading, so in the store, yes. Oh yeah. Yeah, this is because this is like a little bit old, and this was the way in which you actually had to install something to be added to your package.json. Now that's the default. Okay, so this is so common. Let's just make it the default. So yeah, like now if we go to my package.json, we see that now we have all the three React ones that React always comes with: React, React DOM, and React scripts. And now we have React Redux and Redux itself. Cool. So from Redux, we're just gonna get create the store. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else. The store is gonna come from Redux. That's a Redux core component. The provider we're gonna get from React Redux, this is a component. The connect, if I'm not mistaken, we get the connect from React Redux as well, because that function is the one that's gonna let us connect our components to the store. The reducers we're gonna write ourselves, and the actions we write ourselves. So let's create a store. Wait, so let's see in the store. I'm going to create a file called store.js, or sometimes this index.js, since it's inside of the store folder. From here, we're going to import create. Actually, let's do this from Redux. Create store. Yes, create store is an export that comes from Redux. And then we could do const store equal create store. Also, we're just going to do export default store. Now, we're just going to leave this like that for now. Note that here I drew this into one big circle. That's because the store and the reducers are working very close together. In fact, to this create store, we're going to need to then add our reducer. So we're going to get back to the store. I think from here, let me see. I wanted to move on to actually the dispatch. Let's see. Okay, so let's do this. Let's set up this. Let's set up the provider, and then let's see if we can start seeing the store, even though we're not going to be changing it yet. So this is just, nothing really strange here. Calling a function that creates the store, exporting the store. Now the store is going to be used, as I said. So we're going to have this provider component that comes from React Redux that's going to wrap our entire app. So in index.js, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to close this here to the side. Is this font size still readable in the back? Okay. So we have a little bit more space. here we're gonna do in our app just as if this was the React router with browser router. We import provider from React Redux. Provider. And we are also going to import our store. So let's do store from dot slash. Wait, no, I don't think. Do I need to do that? Just like that. Dot slash store slash store. This is why some people call it index, because sort of store slash store. It's a little bit repeating. So we do that. Then in here, we're just going to wrap our app into the provider. Sometimes people call this like the store provider. Provider. Do I have a spelling mistake? Oh, thank you. That's considered a spelling mistake. Cool. So we have the provider. We have store is not defined, but never is defined but never used. Yes.
Sorry, I don't want to derail, but would you wrap provider in browser router, or would you wrap browser router in provider?
That's a good question. It doesn't really matter.
Oh, okay.
It can be first provider, first browser router. Now here, the other thing that we're going to do is to the provider we need to pass the store. So you do store. That's it. Now we have a store. We haven't initialized the store with anything. It's empty. Let me show you here about the store. And let's do some inspecting. But any questions before we do like inspect? This is sort of just setup. This is setup that you anytime you're gonna like initialize Redux for the first time, you're gonna need to do. Cool. So let's look at. Oh, I want us to have like the Redux developer tools. I think. Let's see what we can see. Expected reducer to be a function. Okay. So our app is crashing, and it's saying expected reducer to be a function. This is again what I said. The store works tightly with the reducer, so we need to specify a reducer. And this is. Let's look at the create store documentation. So create store comes from Redux, so that will be in the Redux documentation. Create store. Now, so the create store is creates a Redux store that holds the complete state tree of your application. There should be a single store in your app. Oh, that's very important. You only keep one store. Your store can have, all the information you want, multiple states, but one store. And then a reducer function, which is required. A reducer function that returns the next state tree given the current state tree and an action to handle it. This is what I was talking about. These reducer functions will here. This reducer function will take the state and the action. So for now, I guess let's just do that. Let's just create a function that takes in the current state and an action, and let's have it empty for now. So the reducers, I like to do them in here in the store. In the store, I like to create a folder called reducers. In this case, we're actually going to have just one. And let's say, imagine we will have more than one. In the reducers folder, I'll keep a file called counter reducer.js. Counter reducer.js. Then this is going to be a function, counter reducer, that takes in the store or state and takes in an action. Now we're talking about the reducers. The reducers will look at the action and produce a new state with it. Now here, let's see. Let's initialize against it. So also, this is an important point. The way in which you initialize your store is in the reducer. So, so let's say we want to start with a counter of 0, right? That counter of 0 will be managed by our counter reducer, and we want our state to start with a counter equal to 0. So let's initial. What we do generally is do something like this: const initial state equal an object. Your initial state can be an object, can be an array, can be a primitive number, anything. And here we just sort of similar action. Now counter equal to, let's initialize it at 1. And then from here, let's do state equal initial state. This is we have sort of briefly talked about this, where you can pass sort of default values to a function. And this is saying, like, if no state is passed, which for instance is the example when we first run our application, because we don't have any state. Let's use our initial state. If no state is passed, let's just use our initial state. This, for instance, you can have a function add that takes A and B, and let's say this, add A, B, that just returns A plus B. Right? This function that just adds 2 numbers. If we call this, the function is going to fail, right? Because it's going to be undefined plus undefined. I don't even know what that is. This will fail. So what we could do is sort of pass default values. So let's say A equal 1, B equal 2. What that is saying is, if no A or no B is provided, let's just take 1 and 2. In fact, we can run this code here. Let's do cd src store reducers. Let's do node counter reducer. Well, we are not console logging. We get 3. That is because we define these default values. Let's say we pass in 10. What do you think the result is going to be? 12. Right? Because we pass in A, and if A was passed, take the value of A, which in this case is 10. B was not passed. Cool. So that's the same thing, same argument where, if nothing is passed, let's just take the initial state. Now, I said reducers, and I'm going to keep saying this until you get tired. Reducers need to be pure functions. They must never modify the state in place. They must always create a copy and return the modified copy. That is, I can't do this. I can do state equal state that counter plus 1. Right? I'm modifying the state directly by setting the state. Actually, I can't say this. Counter equal counter plus 1. Can't say this because this is in fact modifying the state reference, right? Modifying the state directly. The way in which you do that is generally const. I like to do like state copy, and we create a copy of the state. Now here the question is, how do you create a copy of an object? You maybe know how to. I hope you know how to create a copy of an array. There are a ton of ways. Now, how do we create a copy of an object? There are also two popular ways. Michael. Oh, like this? I don't know if this is a way, actually. Let's see. New, or let's see, object constructor JavaScript. Prototype constructor. Does it take any value? No, so I haven't seen this one. Any other ways? What is that called? Spread operator. So we could do this. This is literally spreading the properties of the object state into this new object that we're defining with curly brackets. In turn, creating a copy of the state. Another common way is this object.assign. You pass in an empty object and you want state. What this is literally going to do, this is again, the names, they were named for a reason with those names, is going to assign all the properties of state onto this new empty object. So this is how you can make a copy of the state. I prefer for... That's correct, yes. You could actually like do the same way that you do it with arrays. This is often commonly used to add like new properties to the object. We could add a new property. You could also add new elements to an array. Like here, let's say my property equals. That made a copy of state with all the properties of the state, which in this case is counter, and it added my property, which can be anything. But here again, the goal is making a copy of the state. For now, we're not going to modify the state. We're just going to do return state copy. We didn't do anything with the action. We're going to get back to that. And we're going to export counter reducer. Let's do export default. So this is a function that takes in the state, supposed to modify the state based on the action, and return the modified copy. Right? We're just not dealing with the action yet. I want to just sort of get this to work. Now this reducer is what we're going to pass to our create store. That's why it's breaking. That's why our application is breaking here, where it says expected the reducer to be a function. Now let's go here. In our store, then we're going to need to import our reducer. Import counter reducer from current folder reducer / counter reducer. We import the reducer and we just need to pass in the reducer here, counter reducer. See, that fixes our problem. That fixes our problem. Now here, today we're just gonna do one. We're just gonna do one reducer. Tomorrow we're gonna do two. But again, you can think of the reducers as the ones that are managing different parts of the state, right? So you could import the to-dos reducers, the post reducers, the feed reducers, the contact reducers. And we'll need to combine them because to create store, we need to pass a single reducer. That's where combined reducers comes in. Where combined reducers that we're going to talk about tomorrow, it just takes 2 or 3 or however many reducers you have, and it converts them into just one. And you pass that to your store, and everything works exactly the same. Cool. So we define our store. We pass a simple reducer. We're sort of putting just the pieces in place. We have our store, our reducer, have our provider. We don't have a connect yet. Let's do this part last. Let's do this now, which is an action, and our component actually dispatching an action. Let's do, so sort of, let's step back for a second. Let's see the files that we have. We have store. We have the reducers folder with our counter reducer. I'm going to put here on the right. And we have our store. That's it. And in app, or index.js rather, we imported our created store. We pass the store as a prop to the provider. We wrap our app in the provider. Any questions up until this point? Yes,
do we have to pass anything else outside of the counter in app? I feel like I missed a step.
Wait, what file are you looking at?
App.js in the.
No, so here we just have this component. This is the one you're talking about?
All,
yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure I didn't miss it.
Yeah. This is the only component that we're going to deal with for today. Now, so let's look at, actually, I want to see if, now the developer tools are not picking up my Redux store. So let's actually do this all now. Just Google Redux Dev Tools, and it's going to be an extension. And just install that. And this extension is like the React developer tools. It lets you inspect your Redux store. And it's super helpful to visualize the Redux store rather than just console login. Redux DevTools just install the extension, and we're going to need to change. We're going to need to add something in our code for sort of the extension to let us inspect our store because it doesn't feed up by default. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do to sort of set this up is in the documentation page or in the Chrome Web Store page, there's a link to the GitHub repo. So copy that and open it in a new tab. Command T, Command C, and then this takes us to the repo where the developer tools are developed. And you get the same instructions for Chrome or for Firefox. And this is what we need to do. Note this code. Where do we have this code? In the store file, right? To that, we already have a reducer. This is optional, this thing that is commented out here. We just need to add this to be able to inspect our store. So I'm just going to copy that line and literally go here to the store, pass it as the second argument to the create store. And paste it. This here is what is going to sort of connect to the extension and let us sort of inspect.
What is that link?
Say that again?
What is the link for GitHub?
I can share it on Slack. Oh, I don't have Slack open. You can find it here in the Chrome web store at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This link, go to this link, then find in the documentation where they're creating store with, again, like if you know what you're searching for, use the command F, create store, takes you there immediately.
That code works for Firefox and Chrome?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. What the extension does is just it creates this variable in the window object. And with that variable, then you need to call this function, Redux DevTool extension, to initialize and sort of connect to the store for it to let us inspect it. When you install the extension added these two properties to the window object for us to use the extension.
So we do need the plus.
No, you don't need the plus. The plus is just because they're showing just add this. Yeah. Let's share. That goes as the second argument to your create store. Cool. Anyone needs help with the setup? So if you did that correctly, then we should be able to see our store now. Let's see. Save this. Let's go to my app, and in here, let's just refresh. Now here you're gonna see a new tab, or in here just because I have it hidden, I have to click on this, and it says Redux. That's a new tab. We had components and profiler from React. Now we have Redux, and this is the Redux developer tools. Do we have state? And if we go here to state, then we see we have our state with a counter of 1. So make sure that you're able to see it. Cool. So I think from here we could experiment a little bit. The developer tools is cool. They offer like time traveling, because that's like one of the benefits of Redux, where you can replay actions and sort of undo them, thanks to the fact that we have this action atomic piece that we create, and that's the way in which we modify state. I think we could try something here. These developer tools are, I don't know what all these buttons do. We don't need, like, the main part is like here, state. I think we could try it out if we do like type. Oh, actually, let's see this. So here on this right side, you're gonna see all the actions that are dispatched to the store. We see that there is an action that was dispatched, which is the add init. This is an action that is always dispatched. It's dispatched by the initialization of Redux. And that's sort of what, if we go to here, action, yeah, it's just an object. Remember that I said actions are just going to be objects with a type property. So it's an object with a type property that says add init. Also, you can see, I think you can, if you're in state, you can see the state as a tree. This doesn't, let's see, or a chart. There are cool ways in which you can visualize your state later on, so play around with it. I like this then raw, and let's see, test. Input reduces. Oh, this is interesting. This is new. Let's see if we can write our first action here and make that counter go up, at least in the state. Let's see. I think there was a way. If not, we just do it in code. This is upload. Action. Okay, so I don't remember. I think there was a way in which you could create a new action from here and try it out. But let's just jump into the code to actually get that to happen. Now, so here we have the infrastructure that we currently have is the store, and we're passing that to the provider. The provider should be passing that to our components. But remember that before we can actually do that, we will need to connect our components. And once the components are connected, then we can start dispatching actions. So let's look in here. If we go to the React developer tools now in components, we see that now the topmost component is provider. I think there is a way in which you can see the state here as well. Let's see, store. We have store, dispatch. So here we can see the props that provider has the store with some dispatch function, get state, lifted store. I don't know what that one is about. Subscribe, replace, reducer. There seems to be some hooks. And here we have this memo, and we see also sort of like our state being kept here. So we can see that it's sort of verifying in the React developer tools that we have a store with some state, and here as well. Now let's see app. Now we see that provider has that as a hook. Well, it doesn't really matter if it's a hook or props or state. It just matters that it has our information. It has a counter starting with 1, but we can see that that is not being passed to app, for instance. App doesn't have access to the counter that we initialize at 1, nor does counter. Right? So this is where then the connect comes in, this function. Now we can connect app as the parent of our component. We can just also connect our component directly to the store. So let's do that next. So that counter actually gets access to the information in the store. Now for that part, feel free to raise your hand at any time with any questions. For that part, let's go to our counter component, and in here, actually, let's import first. We need to import connect, which again is a function from React Redux. And connect is defined but never used. Then what I said was we need to call connect like this. And it's because we invoke connect, and connect, the invocation of connect returns a function, and that function we're going to call with our component. So let's do that. Let's do connect. We could do this here. Could do it when we import it. It's generally, I think, the most common way is using it here. So we call connect, and we pass our component to the function that connect return, just like that. What this does is then makes our counter a connected component. A component that has access to the store then is known as, that has access to the store or to dispatch is known as a connected component. This component now is connected to the store. We're gonna need to pass something here. We're gonna need to pass something here. I'm just passing null for now. or just nothing. And we're gonna talk about that next. But let's look at how our component counter now is receiving some props. It should be receiving some props. So let's look at that. Let's go back to the developer tools component. Let's refresh this here. Counter. Now we get a prop. We get a new prop. We get a dispatch function prop. This function is the one that we're going to use to dispatch actions to the store. I don't know if you noticed before, but let's do it here. When I don't connect, let me close the reducer and the index so that I can put this to the side. Let's do this. I'm going to export it without connect. If I click on counter, I see I get no props. Props are not being passed to my counter. Once I connect the counter, I get one prop. I don't know why the developer tool sometimes need a refresh. Go to counter, now we get dispatch. This dispatch function is the one that we're going to use to dispatch actions to the store. This prop is being passed by the connect function. This is how, we say that the component is connected because it has access to the store, which at this point, that's the next step. A connected component has access to the store and it has access to dispatch. Right now we got one of the two, which is dispatch. So right now, for instance, with access to dispatch, our component could update the state. It could update that counter that we have in the store. But since it doesn't have access to the state yet to read the state, we wouldn't be able to show it. Now let's look maybe very quickly at the connect documentation. Let's see, this is the Redux or the React Redux? React Redux. And type in here connect. Connect. The connect function connects a React component to a Redux store. It provided this connected component with the pieces of the data it needs from the store and the functions it can use to dispatch actions to the store. It does not modify the component class passed to it. Instead, it returns a new connected component class that wraps the component you passed in. And we can see here that in the signature, we have connect has these optional arguments that we're going to use. It has map state to props, map dispatch to props, and these other two we can just ignore. I've never used them. The documentation has more information on it. Now this map, this was also sort of something that I didn't know why it was named like this. Map dispatch to prop, map state to props. So what we're going to do is, hopefully you will see why they're named this way. These two are going to be functions. The map, let's actually start writing those. So in our component, we generally write those two functions like here. Const map state to props. And so we could do without map dispatch to props because we saw that the dispatch function is already being passed to our component. So we could just call it like this.props.dispatch. Or we could also do it like here, map dispatch to props, which generally what is done here is we just call the dispatch function with the actions that we want. Let's see. I think let's go with the map dispatch to props. Map dispatch to props. So these are two functions. Now this function, so map state to props receives the state here. Map dispatch to props receives the dispatch function here. And then we use these functions in here, in the connect. Just map state to props goes always first, map dispatch to props. We could have also written those functions directly here. I generally tend to separate them like this, just having them individual. Now, these two functions generally return an object that will be passed to your component as props, right? So for now, let's do return, since we know that state is already an object. Now we know that also for this component, we're actually only interested in the counter from the state, which is the only thing we have. So we could do, let's return state here. Map state to props has to return an object. Same for map dispatch to props. Now let me see, do something like return an object. Let's say increment the key, and this is going to be a function who is going to call dispatch. And here we're going to pass an action, as we said earlier. Let's talk about the actions next, but let's just sort of connect these pieces, making sure all the wiring is in place. So now let's look at here at the props that are being passed. Now, if we go to the counter now, we see that our counter as props has the actual counter has an increment function. And you see this is without the map state to props and without the map dispatch to props, we don't get this. This is why, so the name comes from mapping the state that is in Redux to the props of the component. And similar here, map the dispatch function from Redux again to the props in the component so that our component can receive them here in props. Now, for instance, we can actually render the counter, not hard-coded as we have it here. We could just do, we have props here, props, and we can do props.counter now. And we still get that one. Now this one, instead of being hard-coded, it comes from our store. So, questions about this? These two functions are generally like confusing, but just think of them as we have to tap into the store, and we want to have access to whatever we have into the store, as well as a way to update the store. Now, like you can imagine, for instance, having multiple reducers, having multiple parts of state, you will get here. Let's thinking of this app, for instance, where we have, let's say we have a feed part in our store, we have a contact and a messages part. If we're connecting the feed component or any other component, we don't need to get access. Maybe we don't need to get access on the feed to the contacts or the messages. We just care about the feed. That's where map state to props will be more helpful to actually break down the information that you actually need. Only the feed, in this case, only the feed state rather than everything. Right now, since we have just one, hopefully this will be reinforced again tomorrow once we have two reducers with two parts of state, and where we see a component is only interested in one part, that just access that part. And it's cool. So we had these maps, these patch props. Note here that when I was not passing, if I pass in null here, if I don't pass map dispatch to props, my component just gets the dispatch sort of, to call. You could think of map dispatch to props as a pre-step that you can do to set up what are the actions that you want to dispatch, rather than having access to dispatch directly. So let's do the map dispatch to props, and we have increment. So now we have the increment function. Questions up until this point? It's all about well, you can think of when you connect a component to the store, that information, the dispatch function, and the information from the store has to come through props. That's the way. And this function's job is to map that information from the Redux store onto the props of your component. The reduce function, not the reduce, the dispatch function, and the state that you have in there. Yes?
And we don't need to do that in an app. We can just pull it right from provider to counter.
That's correct. That's correct, because we have the provider that's wrapping our entire app. Any component, like here, let's imagine we have this component tree. Any component we can connect directly to the store. Then reducing the prop drilling problem, right? Or the prop drilling problem that you get whenever you're passing functions to update a higher up state, or just passing values, right? Because then now the inbox, as we said, the inbox can then just dispatch an action directly to the store to remove a message, a spam message, right? Instead of having to do it through the parent. So we have our component connected to the store. We are able to see the counter. Let's sort of to reinforce that. If we go to the store, if we go to the reducer and initialize the counter with 100, we should see 100 come up here. That's because our component is reading from the store now. It's reading the state from the store. The next part is actually have our component be able to modify the store. How do we modify the store? What's the thing that's going to let us modify the store? The dispatch function. That is how we're going to dispatch an action. This is why we put this here. Dispatch action to the store. A component will dispatch an action to the store. The action will look like this: an object that makes it to the reducer. The reducers receive the action and proceed accordingly to whatever the action says. So here, so we could do. Let's create our action. So actually, let's do this. So we have this increment function. Let's see if it works first. We have this increment function that is being passed to our component. So let's do console log increment call. So we have our increment function. Our increment function, in turn, the job of the increment function is to call dispatch, to dispatch an action to the store. Right now, I just want to make sure that when I click the button, it fires. From there, we can move on to actually get it. How would I call this increment function when I click a button? How could I call the increment function when I press a button? An event listener. Where? Tell me more about that. Okay. What kind of event listener? on click. And then what do I pass in here? Say that again. Right, it's close. We don't want to call these functions. That's a good point. These functions we don't call ourselves. These functions are called by the connect function. These functions, the map state to props and the match dispatch to props, are the ones that are enabling us to have the access to the state here and to have access to the increment function here. So we never call this ourselves per se. Yes, Joy. Props.increment, that's correct. Cameron, do you have a question? Okay. Yeah, since we define here our increment, here you can define as many functions as you want. In fact, we're gonna do decrement or decrement. I don't know the right pronunciation. Same thing. Decrement. And we got a fail to compile. Let's see what this is about. Oh, that's because we left the onClick empty. Now here we can just have, handle regular event listener, handle increment. Oh, since we're inside a function, let's do const. E. And we do, and let's pass in this function here. Handle increment. From here, then we just call the increment function that came through props, thanks to the map dispatch to props. So we just do props, props.increment, just like that. Increment, like that. And let's see, we actually get the console log. Actually, let's do this for both the handle increment and decrement. Now, at this point, we're just checking, oh, we no longer need this variable. At this point, we're just checking if that function, increment, that came through props, that we define the map dispatch to props, is just being called. This is just console logging. I said the goal of these functions are to dispatch an action. We're going to get to that just in a second. Right now, let's verify that we see these console logs, because I like to verify every step. So let's go to console. Let's click plus, increment call, minus, this one doesn't work. Oh, add an event listener. Oops. Handle decrement. Cool. So we have our functions firing. So this is a very common pattern, just like the React pattern of having an event listener with a part of stage for an input box. This is the pattern sort of with Redux. In our map dispatch to props, we're going to have functions. We're going to return an object that has functions inside. This is an object with two properties, increment and decrement, and the value of those properties are functions, right? Yes?
So like basically you just pass those functions, but you can also use them in the same file too, like as.
Right, I think, wait, say that again?
I'm like looking at this, you put the functions in there, but then you call them as props in the same file.
Right. These functions, these two functions, map state to props, they could live anywhere as long as they're imported here, and we pass them like this to connect. See that connect? To connect, we pass map state to props and map dispatch to props. And then with the result of that, we call the counter. So they could live anywhere. The key to remember is that anything you specify in these objects, in the objects that you return from map state to props and map dispatch to props, will make it onto your component through props. Therefore, the name map dispatch to props. To props, right? And then the component then can just use those functions by accessing them through props with props.increment. The way that we're accessing the state through props.counter. Other questions? Yes.
I'm not sure if it's the same question, but why can't we just put props.decrement inside the
Oh, here, like instead of handle increment props.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Right. We could. What I don't like to do this is just because now my increment, if I need the event, then I end up moving that logic here, right? Like let's say we're having an input box that we need e.target.value. If I need the e.target.value, I'll need to pass it in here. And generally, this is sort of like it's a point a little bit hard to see. Just I feel like these functions don't need to be aware of any component or DOM stuff like the event, for instance. I prefer to do that like here, where we have this function that is inside of the component that is aware of the event, that's aware that is being an event listener, and then just call my increment. That is unaware of where it is used and by who, for instance. Right? So it's sort of about, you could do it, I feel like accessing the event, for instance, this is like, accessing the event on a map dispatch to props, for me, it feels a little bit unnatural. So it's like, what is the event doing in here? If I'm looking just at the map dispatch to props, it will be, I have to make sense of why is the event here if we're not in a component, for instance. So yeah, generally better to wrap it into a function that accesses the state. Now, so there's so many ways in which we could do this. We have our functions called in. What's the step that we're missing then to update the state? To update the information in the store. So we have the component, we have access to the store. Let's add to this here. It's like props. The props that the connect function passes to your component are your state and this patch that then we handle in the map state to props and the map dispatch to props. We could have, as I said earlier, we could just have access in the component, access to this patch, and just dispatch the action like that. This is generally a more common pattern where you actually have a dispatch to props and map dispatch to props and map state to props. So we have our components calling these functions, but the job of these functions are to dispatch an action. That's the part we're not doing yet. I think, let's see, they are actually dispatching an action. Actually, I have that code commented out. But let's uncomment this one, for instance. Remember that I said the action, we're going to pass the action to dispatch, and that action is just a plain object. Let's see this. See if anything breaks. Oh, something broke. It says actions may not have an undefined type property. Have you misspelled a constant? So this is saying, let's see if it breaks when we are in the Redux developer tool. Let's open this up here. Let's refresh this page. I want to see if any of those appear here. No, they don't make it. They don't even make it here. So this goes back to what I said in the beginning. These actions are plain objects, but they must have a type property. They must have a type property. So we can do something like, yeah, we can do something like the object that we're going to pass to this patch has a type of increment. These types, it's generally good practice to write them all capital. So type increment, and let's do type decrement for the next one. Type increment and decrement. These are our actions. Actions, plain objects with a type property that must be there. And let's see if anything changed in our component. So let's click plus and let's click minus, and we can see here then that actions are starting to pop up here. We sent these actions to the store. Those actions, remember that they are going to pass through the reducers first. The reducers are the ones that are actually going to modify the state by looking at the action, see what the action wants to do, decrement or decrement, and returning a new state. Now here, I think, let's see, does this work? Trying to see, this doesn't work. Oh no, it does work. So you can see this is sort of the time travel, not that we're gonna use this a lot, but as I moved, you see how this one, I'm not sure if you can see it, it's so bright and white, these are all grayed out. So this kind of sort of tells you, this lets you replay your actions to see if when anything went wrong. Right? This is something we couldn't do with plain React state. Right, like this is also for thinking that we have a complex application where there are a lot of moving parts when the user opens a drawer, when they remove a message, that maybe you want to change the color. There's a ton of stuff going on, and Redux can help you manage that through this sort of interface that lets you see in what order were the actions taken. Now, questions up until here. We are dispatching actions now. That is an improvement. We created our actions, we made them, we dispatched them, they are making it to the reducers. They're not modifying the store yet, because remember that's the reducer's job. And the reducer has to look at the action. What does the action want to do? The type of the action, and act accordingly. So also, let's see, or actually before we go there, any questions about what we did here with the actions, the type? These actions, I think we can see this tomorrow. Generally, like you can do, since these are going to be, actually we're going to get to see that. I'll just talk about it tomorrow. Increment, decrement, we are dispatching those actions. Now let's look at the reducer running. So I said, according to this diagram, an action makes it to the reducer first. So if we put a console log in the reducer, that should be the next thing we see. So let's do, here at the top, let's do const log, this console log counter reducer running. And let's let's console log the action, sure. So you remember that, again, the reducers will receive the state and the action as the second argument. So we have the state here that we initialize with that initial state, and the second thing is the action. So let's say we put this console log here in the reducer. Oh, in fact, we can see the first console log here. In this console log, we have the init action that is the first thing that runs in the console log. We can see it here. So our reducer is already running once the store is created for the first time. Let's see if it's running on clicks. So I'll do that. We got counter reducer is running, and this is the action with type increment. Decrement was called, and the counter reducer run thereafter with decrement and so on. And therefore, then here we end up sort of with the log that is the same of the React of the Redux developer tools, right? Where we can see the actions happening thanks to this console log. Of course, the Redux developer tools are better for like the time traveling or more fine-grained inspection that gives you. Questions up until this point, but reducer. Reducer is still not doing anything yet. That's what's next. Okay, so I said if you remember anything today, just remember the responsibilities of the parts of this diagram. Who is supposed to do what and at what time? The reducer, I said, it takes in the state, takes in the action. The reducer's job is to look at the action and modify, make a copy of the state, modify the copy of the state according to what the action dictates, basically, or what the action says. So we have these actions that are saying increment or decrement. So let's actually do that. So if we go, that's the reducer's job. Trying to see if we could just do, yeah, the first stop is making a copy of the state. Current, let's do current state. First step. Now, we have two types of actions, right? We have a decrement and a decrement. When we get an action with type increment, we want an increment. When we get an action of type decrement, we want to decrement. How could we do that? Condition and if statements, right? If the action is increment, let's just increase the counter to 1. If the action is decrement, let's decrement the action, the counter to 1. So, yes. What is, I forgot the name for if statements and switch statements. Control flow, right? We're gonna control whether what happens. So like an if statement, a for loop, all those are mechanisms for controlling the flow of your program. Now in Redux, generally you will have a few actions you want to perform. Like, let's say, thinking of the inbox again, we have receive inbox messages, add new inbox message if one arrived, remove, delete inbox message, get sent messages, and there are going to be more action types than just these two that we have here. So we could do an if statement, but then when you have more action types, it becomes a little bit too much saying else, if the type is increment, do this, else if the type is decrement, do that. And there is just, when you have that pattern, sort of that if, else if, else if, and so on, we just use the switch, which we saw in Unit 1. We talked about how the switch component on React works sort of like it. Now we're going to see one use case more helpful for the switch. So we could just do switch, and we say, let's look into action dot type. And switch is another control flow statement. And then, what do you remember about switch? Joy. Cases and a default. Right, exactly. So let's do when the action type, when the case is that the action type is, no colon yet. Oh, sorry. The case is when the action type is increment. What do we want to do? We want to increment the counter. Remember that we want to increment it in the copy of the state, not in the actual state. So we're going to do state copy dot equal counter state copy dot counter plus 1. So when the case is that action type is increment, we want to increase the counter to 1. Actually, we could also do, since we already have the copy, we could just do this. I'm doing some unnecessary work here. Just do this, right? Because it's a copy. We already made the copy. Cool. So then let's do the same for the decrement. So, after that we do break. Then we do the next case. If the case is that action that type is decrement, we want to do the opposite. Copy these 2 lines. Remember that cases always have to do the colon there. Don't use curly brackets. Separate them by a line, I like. State copy counter -1. And the default. We must always include a default. The default is when is neither one of these cases, then return just the state without any modification. The default return state copy. So expecting an assignment. Let's look at this next. But what we could do is we always need to return the state copy. So I think there is 2 approaches here. We could get rid of the default and just return state copy. Oh, but we need to close, right? Close the switch in here and just return the state copy, which we already had. Right. If it's one of these cases, modify the state copy in this way. Again, this is what I was saying about the reducer is supposed to make a copy of the state, modify the copy of the state according to what the action dictates. This is what I was meaning by that. If it's an increment, increment. If it's a decrement, decrement. If it's save post, save the post, and so on. And the last thing that we need to do is just return that modified copy. If it's neither of these cases, then just still return the copy, which is going to be the same thing that we had before. So here. Yeah, so here, note here first that we first make a copy of the current state. We say that state will start at 100 at the moment. That's what we have here. So we made a copy of the state, and then here we're just modifying that copy. So here we're saying, actually this is wrong. Thank you. We need to say state counter equal state copy. Thank you very much. That's why pair programming is important. Let's copy that counter +1. Thank you. That's a good observation as well. We could do plus plus or minus minus. Yeah, these two are doing the same thing. This one is just increasing with the sort of without taking advantage of plus plus. This one is decreasing, taking advantage of minus minus. Okay, so I think we're good here. The only part that I don't remember with absolute certainty is the default case here. I think if there's no default, as we'll find out. The current thought is if it didn't fall into any of these cases, then the copy of the state was never modified, and that was returned, right? And because it's a copy of the state, everything that was there should also be there. Let's see. Let's try it out here, I guess. Plus, oh, we have a counter working. I agree. If we go, let's go back here to Redux. Run this a little bit. Maybe restart. Let's do 1. The increment was fired. This here, it tells you, this is the current state. Another cool thing about this tool is that it lets you see the diff, which is it compares the previous store with the new one, and it shows you where it changed. So it tells me here that it was 100 first, and then it changed to 101. I do that, and then after the next action, it changed from 101 to 102, and so on. And again, we can replay them. Oh, this even changes in the app as well. So the time traveling. You could also slow it down to replay. And this is then convoluted setup for Redux that is just sort of necessary to at least learn a little bit of the concepts. Yeah, because an extra, like, if we try to do this, for instance, with like your unit assessment or with one of your group projects, we'll get even more lost on all the stuff that is going around. I think it's a question, yeah.
What is like the history of it?
I don't really know. Probably somewhere internally in the store. Yeah, I think we look in here into not performance in components that the provider had something. So we see some stuff here that we don't use. Yeah, it must be saved somewhere around here. I'm not sure if we will have access to it though, but yeah. Or maybe it's just the extension handling that for us, not really Redux. So, questions, comments? That was a lot, and for going up 1 and going down 1, a lot of setup. And this is why like a lot of people sort of criticize Redux because there's a lot of boilerplate, and it is a lot of boilerplate when you're starting off. But then that will pay off as changing your state becomes easier, as well as connecting information, connecting components to the store becomes painless, and just having your state more organized, not having to like in here. It's like we have a feed, we have a post list that is going to iterate over the post, and we have or actually no, this is a better example. like inbox, what does it like? Inbox doesn't care about the notifications, or well, maybe it does because of when you get a new message, you also get a notification. I'm trying to find an example where it's just a component that doesn't care about other information that we can connect directly to the store without having to care about other information not related to its functioning. One thing here is you see how we have these strings that I want to talk about. We have these strings that are the type, right? Increment here and increment here. You're gonna see this. If I misspell this, then my app doesn't work because I misspell my increment with a double M, and I don't have the corresponding case, right? So if I go here, my increment now doesn't work. The increment still works, but my increment doesn't work. This is just because we are keeping two pieces of information that are supposed to be the same at all times in separate places. So generally what we do is in the store, we create a file called action types, and this file just does, we can just export increment equal increment. We're gonna need to do const. So they're being exported individually. This one is decrement. And then we just import these variables into our reducer. So we do const increment decrement from import from current action types. And then instead of writing these strings every time, we just use the variable that holds the string, which will look then like this. In case it's increment, in case it's decrement. Now these are just variables holding the strings. We're holding the strings just to prevent against typos that we will unavoidably do. And we'll do that there, and also we'll do that like in our component here. Instead of having this, we're gonna do increment. So I think this is gonna, yeah. VS Code is cool because like I type increment, and I don't know how it does it, but it reads all my files and it finds where I'm exporting increment. So if I type enter here, it's gonna import it for me at the top. Type increment, and if we go to the top, it imported that for me. Actually, the action type shouldn't be inside of the reducers. So I'm gonna take that back onto the store. Move. It even updated that for me here. Store, yeah, action types are not necessarily with the reducers. In fact, some people create another folder called actions where they keep the action types. So let's do that there, and I'll think this one here, and let's do decrement here. Now, if we handle increments, assign a value but never use decrement. Oh, this was still using my suggestion. This should use, instead of calling that directly, handle increment. Let's see. Still works. Cool. So this is sort of, type of prevention, where we have that file action types. Since these are constants, like this is variables that are not going to change, we generally do it with const and all capital. So it's sort of a convention. You should follow this convention. It's a good convention. What else? Let's see. Oh, some people also do like this. You see how we talked about an action just being a simple object with a type. Some people also have what they call action creators, which is just a function that returns this object, and then you just call. They do, they'll do something like actions creators dot increment, something like this, where they just have some action creators object that when you call like the increment, it just creates that object. It creates an object with a type increment. But so right now what we're doing is just having the objects being defined straight when we pass it in. But the pattern is all the same. To this pass, you pass an action object. That action object gets to the dispatchers. Sorry, not the dispatchers, the reducers. The reducer, as we talked about here, receives the previous state, and the action, it looks like the action makes a copy of the state. It modifies the copy of the state according to the action, in this case incrementing or decrementing, according to the action type, I should say more accurately, and it's supposed to return the copy of the state. And right now here we had like expected a default case. So this is a warning, we could ignore it, but let's just address it because most warnings are helpful. So let's do this. This is saying that I'm missing a default case here. We can just do return state copy. We could do, since these two cases are like if it's increment, do that and then break. The break leave us outside of the switch and return in the state. Same for this one. If it's decrement, this happens, we break, we go to the return state copy, which is modified. Of course, we could also just return here directly, like here, return state copy. State copy, and then sort of, we would no longer need the breaks because the return is already breaking out, and same thing here. So that is sort of up to you. Okay, just one return at the end, but that's sort of redundant with the default or a return per case. Yeah. That's a good question. So, yeah, I think that's possible. Break. Yeah, that's another solution. Just write one return, 3 breaks. I like this one. Thank you. Any final questions, comments? If you have this mental model of how things are working, if you remember what the pieces are doing, then when you read documentation, or when you're actually looking at this code later on, I think it will just be easier, just knowing what the responsibilities are for each part. Yes.
Where you putting it?
I'll put it in a repo right now and then share it on Slack, and so on. I also have the recording. Tomorrow, what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at Redux again, sort of with having another part of state, not only the counter, but maybe something else. For the afternoon, we are, let's see, we're going to be working on the Redux Lab, which is going to be add more action types to this, so that I think it adds if it's, so you're going to add like 2 buttons, I think. Add if it's odd. So if the number that you currently have is odd, just add 1 to it. If it's even, add like 3 or something like that. Right, and you can have this as a starting point. Let's see. I think there was something else that Des told me about the afternoon. Oh, we're gonna be debriefing with. I think that's what it is. Debriefing with the React group projects, and yeah, we're gonna be sitting with each one of you, sort of have a conversation about how it went, how to improve, etc. So be expecting that we're gonna call you up to meet with us. That's it. Thank you very much. I hope you have a good lunch.
So I don't know what the issue is, but like when I refresh, it automatically has these, and I can't see where.
That's interesting. So you have some actions that are being dispatched automatically.
Yeah. And then unless I do this like a million times, but then you'll see init fires twice.
That's weird. That's definitely weird. Let's see. Oh wait. So when you do it wait, what if you do it now?
So I go like this, and if I hit a refresh, it'll automatically whatever was in the past.
Oh,
right?
I see. Oh, so then maybe that's related with the extension. So click on here. Wait, let me see if yours looks exactly like mine. I think maybe it was a button that we clicked. This is the same thing, like lock, pause. That seems to be a bug with the extension rather than with your code, even though let's look at your code.
Okay.
Right, because it's only when you refresh a ton of times.
It will actually clear out, but init still shows twice.
Oh, right, like when you refresh
One time,
one time,
all of the old stuff.
when you refresh 2 times real quick. Oh,
More. I did it like 7 times.
wow. Let's look at the code just sort of to discard anything that might be here. Let's see then the way in which you dispatch the actions. Handle increment. This is an on click. Perhaps increment, decrement. That all looks fine. You have the state returning this object. No invocation or anything. And wait, so this is the reducer, right?
Yeah.
Let's see the store. Kind of reducer. Yeah, you're not invoking, which is fine, which is what we want. This all looks correct. But I wanted to look at, let's look at the version of